December 17, 1944. 0530 hours. Hansfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank engine coughed and sputtered and then it died. SS Abashto Banura Yahim Piper struck the turret hatch with his fist and the metal rang in the darkness before sunrise. The driver Unsharv Bear tried to bring the 700 horsepower Maybach back to life and nothing happened. The fuel gauge sat on empty. Herr Oberanurov Bear called from his compartment with a voice pulled tight by fear and said that the reserve tank was also dry. Piper climbed down from his command tank and his boots crushed the frozen Belgian earth. Around him the most powerful armored thrust the Wehrmacht had gathered for Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Ardennes offensive stood silent. 67 tanks. 149 half-tracks. Nearly 5,000 of the elite Waffen-SS soldiers. All stopped by dry fuel lines. Through the morning mist Piper saw the abandoned American position at Hansfeld, which was a key supply point for the United States 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had left in a rush and the fires in oil drums still burned and coffee steamed in metal cups. Ahead of him stood row after row of jerry cans. There were thousands in the olive drab color of American fuel containers. Piper walked toward them with care as if entering a chapel. His adjutant Helpetum Führer Hans Gruller pried open a can and smelled the sharp scent of benzene and high-octane gasoline while the men began to refuel their vehicles with frantic speed. Piper paced among the stacks and counted. The numbers shocked him. 50,000 gallons. Enough to feed his entire calm grouper for a push toward the Meuse River. Enough to tilt the offensive. In a single forward dump the Americans had left more fuel than many German divisions had seen in half a year. Yet as he watched American fuel flow into German tanks a weight settled on him like fog. If the Americans could walk away from such stores then the war was already lost. Germany had not only miscalculated. Germany had failed to grasp the nature of its enemy. 6 months earlier at Hansfeld in June 1944 Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, had placed before the Führer a report that should have ended any plan for attack. Allied bombing had broken the synthetic fuel lifeline of the Wehrmacht. The Luna Works produced 175,000 tons in April and only 5,000 tons in September. The Burgues hydrogenation plants at Pitzblehammer and Brooks ran at less than 10%. The figures spelled a fate that could not be escaped. In 1944 the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany with all synthetic output and the captured Romanian fields produced 33 million barrels, which was less than 2% of American production. The Third Reich tried to wage mechanized war with horse-drawn logistics. America drenched its armies in fuel. Major Friedrich Simman of the Wehrmacht Logistics Command calculated that the Ardennes offensive needed 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Hitler assigned 5 million gallons. Transport failures cut the delivered amount in half. The German plan gambled the entire drive on seizing enemy depots. That was not strength. That was a confession of weakness. At the same time the Americans built a petroleum network across France called PLU, which meant pipeline under the ocean, and they ran the Red Ball Express around-the-clock truck system that hauled 12,500 tons a day to the front. By December 1944 American forces in Europe burned 1.2 million gallons each day and received 1.4 million gallons, and they grew reserves while fighting. Johann Piper was not a fool. At 29 he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, and he wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. On the Eastern Front he had learned that in modern war fuel outweighed ammunition. His camp grouper was named the Schwerpunkt for the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14, 2 days before the start, Piper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army, spoke without decoration. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." The allocation for Camp Grouper Piper was 31,000 gallons, which covered 50 miles of combat. The Meuse was 65 miles away. Failure was inside the numbers from the start. As the column formed on December 16, Piper issued strict orders. Tanks would move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would be shut down during any halt longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American fuel dumps ranked above tactical goals. The contrast with American method could not have been sharper. That morning Captain James Rose of the United States 743rd Tank Battalion, only 20 miles from Piper, noted in his diary that he received fuel resupply of 8,000 gallons, which was the third delivery that week, and the storage tanks were already full. December 16, 1944. 05:30 hours. The German artillery that opened Operation Watch on the Rhine expended more rounds in 2 hours than whole operations had been given earlier in the war, and even that display hit shortages. Piper moved at 7 in the morning and was already late. The roads that German maps drew as highways were narrow lanes and many were not paved. Traffic jams formed as vehicles built for the Russian steppes crawled through the Ardennes forest. At Lanzarote, which was the first goal, the column met a surprise. One American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon held the most powerful German armored column for almost 10 hours. During the wait, vehicles idled and burned fuel. When the force broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17, the column had covered 20 miles and spent 40% of its fuel. At that rate they would stop before the halfway point to the MOS. The Hansfeld dump was not a major center. It was a forward Class 3B supply point for the 99th Infantry Division. What Piper found there still exceeded a monthly fuel issue for an entire German panzer division. Hauptführer Hans Groller later said that they found pyramids of jerry cans, each with 5 gallons and stacked 3 meters high for perhaps 200 meters, and the Americans had not tried to destroy them. The captured fuel mixed aviation gasoline and motor fuel at 80 octane or higher. German vehicles and the temperamental Maybach engines in Tiger tanks were built for 74 octane, and the American gasoline was too good and caused trouble in several engines. As the men refueled, they found more. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann discovered shipping manifests. He read English from his father's import work before the war. The papers showed fuel shipped from Texas to New York to Liverpool to Normandy and then trucked 400 miles to Hansfeld in less than 6 weeks. The pipeline network proved even more formidable than many had imagined. Operation Pluto stretched lines beneath the English Channel and pushed 1 million gallons every day from Britain. From the coast the pipes reached inland like arteries. The Cherbourg-Paris line moved 800,000 gallons each day. The Seine line carried 650,000 more. By December 1944 the Allied armies in northwest Europe were burning 7.5 million gallons each day while receiving a little over 8 million. Supplies were growing even as the fighting intensified. On December 18 Piper advanced deeper into Belgium and the scale of the German problem became undeniable. At shore his men seized another depot. 5,000 gallons vanished in 3 hours of combat. In battle a Tiger burned 2.5 gallons with every mile. A Panther used 1.5 gallons per mile. In the rough Ardennes terrain consumption rose by 40% and every halt bit into the tanks. Helped Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, wrote that by midday on December 18 they had already burned 67,000 gallons since the offensive began and had captured perhaps 55,000. They were operating in a constant deficit. American listeners following German radio through ultra-intercepts understood Piper's shortage and acted. General Courtney Hodges ordered all units to deny gasoline to the enemy wherever capture was possible and to destroy threatened stocks. That same day American C-47 transports flew 316 sorties to Bastonia and delivered supplies including 160,000 gallons of fuel. More fuel flew to a besieged garrison in a day than all of Piper's Calm Grouper could muster. By December 19 Piper fought around Stoumont and the crisis deepened. Tanks were left behind with dry fuel tanks rather than from battle damage. Piper gathered what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one attack or one retreat but not both. Allied staffs planned ahead for January while the fighting raged. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the coming month and the request passed without debate. Quantity was only part of the contrast. American equipment aimed at standardization and efficiency. A Sherman used about 0.8 of a gallon for each mile where a Tiger drank 2.5. Loaded American trucks could reach 8 miles on a gallon. Parts matched across fleets and maintenance stayed simple. German formations ran a maze of captured and domestic vehicles with clashing needs. French tanks wanted different oil than German Panthers, and Soviet trucks demanded different parts than German Opels. Every mismatch made logistics slower and harder. On December 20th, a radio message reached Piper and it cut away the last hope. A fuel convoy was destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply was possible. Continue with available resources. Piper gathered his commanders. Sturmbannführer Vera Pertka gave a blunt measure. There was fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers and the Meuse lay 30 kilometers away. Murat Gruller later testified that the Obersturmbannführer told the officers that they were facing an enemy who would burn more gasoline to keep it from German hands than the Germans had received for the entire operation, and that what had seemed miraculous at Hansfeld meant nothing to the Americans and that victory was impossible. The idea spread through higher commands. General Otto von Manteuffel of the 5th Panzer Army later wrote that when he learned Americans had chosen to destroy 8 million gallons rather than risk capture, he knew the offensive had failed before it truly began. Colonel Friedrich von Donder was taken on December 23 and told interrogators that American soldiers threw away chocolate while his men had not seen chocolate in 2 years, and that the Americans burned millions of gallons while Germans measured by the liter, and that no army could fight such abundance. By December 21, Piper was encircled at Les and his armored force could not move. Around him stood the 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne and the 3rd Armored, and together those American formations held a fuel allotment of 340,000 gallons for that day alone. Piper's own supply was close to 1,000 gallons. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote to his family that the Germans near them had stopped because their tanks were empty, and he added that their captain joked that more gasoline went into heating coffee than the enemy had for fighting vehicles. What followed showed industrial war at full strength. The northward turn of Patton's Third Army demanded 350,000 gallons simply to reposition units, and by German standards such an action looked impossible, yet it was completed in 3 days. On December 23 the weather cleared and Allied aircraft launched 2,000 sorties, and each flight burned fuel at a pace that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 aircraft consumed 300 gallons in an hour and B-26 bombers used 200 gallons in the same span. In a single day the air effort expended more gasoline than Germany had assigned to the entire offensive. During the night of December 23 to December 24 Piper left his vehicles and slipped away on foot. Out of 119 tanks and assault guns that set out at the opening of the attack, 39 still functioned but had no fuel to move. Those machines were destroyed with the ammunition that remained. Oberreiter Heinz Gauls later described how they drew the final fuel from every vehicle, and he judged the total to be about 200 gallons, and he said the Oberstführer destroyed his own command tank. Equipment worth millions of Reichsmarks was lost because fuel tanks were dry. Of the 5,000 men who had marched with KF Grouper Piper, roughly 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles and taken several depots, and they had learned how Allied supply really worked. Word of what Piper saw spread fast inside German headquarters. On December 26 Field Marshal Walter Model reviewed reports about captured American fuel, and his chief of staff noted his reaction. The field marshal looked at the totals again and again and saw 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld and 2 million burned at Stavelot and 8 million destroyed rather than seized. He said that they were not fighting the same war. Hitler was told on December 28 and he rejected the conclusion. Speer wrote that Hitler called the numbers propaganda, and when shown photographs of the fire at Stavelot he claimed they were cinema tricks, yet the officers and the enlisted ranks grasped the reality. Greer Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife that Americans destroyed more fuel in a day than they received in a month, and that Americans drove tanks the way Germans marched, and he concluded that the war was lost. The fuel crisis pointed to a larger fact. By 1944 America produced half of the world's manufactured goods, with a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a ship every day, and a tank every 7 minutes. Petroleum figures dwarfed the Axis. The United States refined 1.8 billion barrels. The Soviet Union produced 110 million barrels. Germany, including synthetic output, reached 33 million barrels. Japan produced 2.6 million barrels. Together the Axis yielded less than 2% of American petroleum. Every major German offensive after 1942 was shackled by fuel, and every American push was carried by an abundance that German planners could not imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen wrote of an episode on December 27. A logistics officer explained that storms had cut fuel arrivals to 500,000 gallons in a day. Men worried until someone observed that this amount already exceeded the full allowance that Germany had assigned to its entire offensive. Prisoners of war from the Ardennes said the greatest shock was not American guns but American ease with material things. They watched United States soldiers toss aside meals that were only half-eaten. They watched men burn gasoline for warmth. That sight broke morale more than shell bursts. Aus-G.A. Reichelm told his interrogators that German units had known American output only as a number on a page. Seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed made the truth solid. Every German who witnessed that casual plenty understood the war was beyond saving. Word moved through letters in spite of censors. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote that Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They give chocolate to dogs. They shoot artillery for a Christmas salute. We cannot struggle against an opponent whose resources seem without end. The blow to the spirit undercut myths of German superiority. How could a decadent society hold such wealth while the master race searched for basic supplies? At the Nuremberg trials, German leaders returned again and again to logistics and most of all to fuel. Field Marshal Kittel stated that from 1940 to 1941 we held operational superiority. By 1944 we could not shift forces because fuel was absent, while Americans moved entire armies as if they were chess pieces. Piper, tried for the Malmedy massacre, said that after December 17 every choice came under the shadow of fuel scarcity. We could not maneuver or pursue or withdraw with purpose. Americans moved at will while we counted leaders. General Heinz Guderian observed that when Piper seized 50,000 gallons the event meant everything to him and nothing to the Americans, and at that moment the war had ended. The lesson is clear. Industrial war reaches decision through production totals and not through personal valor. The romance of battle died in the Ardennes among vehicles that had empty tanks. Dr. Richard Overy calculated that by 1944 the ratio of Allied to Axis production passed 5-1 in major fields. In petroleum it neared 50-1. No skill in training or tactics could offset such margins. The United States built 324,750 aircraft. Germany built 119,097. The United States produced 88,410 tanks. Germany built 46,857. Most telling of all, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 while Germany survived on 33 million barrels. December 24, 1944. Piper and his men moved on foot through American lines while leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks and 177 other vehicles. In that moment the scale of the truth became clear. They had seized 50,000 gallons, which had felt like a miracle, yet against an opponent able to burn fuel by the millions that prize meant nothing. Unterfuhrer looked back in 1975 and said the feeling began that morning at Hansfeld when we found American gasoline and cheered as if fortune had smiled. By that evening, after learning that Stavelot was set ablaze, we understood that the battle was already lost. The Americans possessed so much that they could destroy what we would have died to keep. The 50,000 gallons were less than a single American armored division used in 2 days and less than the Red Ball Express consumed in 3 hours, a mere rounding error in daily Allied use. Major General J. Lorton Collins later wrote that German attempts to seize fuel showed a misjudgment. German leaders assumed fuel was valued as an irreplaceable treasure. They could not grasp that the Americans could burn millions rather than accept any tactical harm. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed because of unforgiving arithmetic that governs industrial war. The thrust drank about 2.8 million gallons, representing roughly 40% of the total allocation, with the remainder hoped for from captured stores. During those days American forces consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times as much. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. The worst loss was the collapse of illusion. Every German who witnessed the abundance on the other side understood that Germany was no longer fighting a contest but enduring a slow execution. Jim Piper survived imprisonment until 1956 for war crimes. On July 14, 1976 he was killed at his home in France by unknown assailants. In 1967 he told the historian Henry Lehman that finding that depot was the worst discovery. If we had exhausted our fuel earlier we might have withdrawn with some dignity. Instead we learned that Americans had oceans while we held drops. We learned that our effort was impossible. The lesson reaches beyond the Second World War. In industrial war logistics comes before tactics. Production outweighs bravery. Abundance overcomes dedication. The German soldier of 1944 may have been better trained and more experienced, yet it did not matter. American power stood on industry that could waste more than Germany could make. That truth lived in every jerry can at Hansfeld, in every gallon burned at Stavelot, and in every pipeline that crossed France. Wars between industrial powers would be decided by factories and refineries and not by brilliant generals. Colonel Trevor Dupuy stated that in December 1944 each American soldier received 67 pounds of supplies each day. Each German soldier received 3 pounds. Americans spoke about waste as a problem. German troops looked at that waste and saw an abundance beyond imagination. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans gathered at Lays. The museum there shows Piper's Tiger tank in the exact place where the fuel ran out. The date was December 23, 1944. Former Unratsea Karl Wortmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. Anderson said that they always wondered why the advance stopped and that they thought it was a tactical pause. Wortmann answered with a bitter laugh and said that the tanks had no fuel and that American troops burned millions of gallons to keep it from capture and that the Germans could not fight against that. Anderson grew quiet and said that they never knew the Germans were that short and that they had so much that they never thought about it. That exchange captured the truth of December 1944. One side measured by the gallon. The other side dealt in millions. One side fought for each jerry can. The other side burned oceans. The outcome was set in advance. German records preserved the proof. The War Diary of Army Group B for December 1944 reads like a ledger of exhaustion. December 16 the offensive begins and fuel stands at 70% of the minimum. December 17 Piper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18 multiple depots are destroyed and more than 5 million gallons are lost. December 19 fuel shortages immobilize units. December 24 Piper orders the abandonment of vehicles and the cause is fuel exhaustion. The First Army reported its own figures. December 16 reserves stand at 3.7 million gallons. December 17 2.2 million gallons are destroyed to prevent capture. December 18 1.8 million gallons are received. December 24 reserves reach 4.1 million gallons. Americans treated millions with indifference. Germans guarded single cans. Quantity was only one part of the story. American fuel also meant technical superiority. American refineries mastered catalytic cracking and produced higher octane fuel more efficiently than German hydrogenation. American 100-octane aviation fuel gave aircraft a performance edge over German planes that ran on 87-octane synthetic fuel. Americans also perfected additives that Germany could not replicate, including tetraethyl lead and ethylene dibromide detergents. German engines that were designed for lower quality fuel often ran poorly on captured American gasoline. The shortage of fuel shaped every soldier. Gerrit Hans Muller wrote on December 20 that the unit marched 30 kilometers. There was no fuel for trucks. They passed abandoned American vehicles with engines running for warmth. The Americans left engines running. The Germans marched through snow. Medical services were crippled. Ambulances could not evacuate the wounded. Hospitals could not run generators. Men died while they waited for transport that never arrived. Oberarch Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting testified that they had excellent surgeons and supplies captured from Americans but no fuel for ambulances and that men died who could have been saved with a 10-kilometer transport. These discoveries shattered German propaganda about American weakness. Soldiers had been taught that Americans were soft and unable to endure war. Soon they learned that Americans could burn and discard more supplies than Germany could ever gather. Goebbels's diary dated December 28 describes a collapse in spirit across the ranks. Letters home speak of American superiority and the slow erosion of the official story. Rumors and eyewitness tales moved faster than censors. The myth of German superiority could not survive a direct meeting with American logistics. The failure in the Ardennes would leave Germany with nothing except defensive positions. At Nuremberg, General Jodl explained that after the Ardennes they understood the war was lost and that they had already played their last card while the enemy still held every advantage. The Allies recognized German desperation and struck directly at fuel production. By February 1945, German fuel output had stopped. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly. Training was cancelled. The Wehrmacht froze in place and mobile Allied forces broke it apart piece by piece. In the spring of 1945 the front offered surreal scenes. German units surrendered because they could not move. Entire panzer divisions sat powerless while Allied columns passed them on the road. General Major Fritz Baulein described having 42 functioning tanks, experienced crews and full ammunition racks, yet only 300 liters of fuel, which was not enough to reach the next town. The crews destroyed their own machines and walked into captivity. Meanwhile, the American advance slowed only when there were too many vehicles on the road. Third Army alone operated 15,000 vehicles. Camp Grupper Piper and its fuel crisis showed how industrial capacity decided the outcome of the Second World War. When Piper stood among captured jerry cans that December morning, he finally saw the truth. They faced an enemy whose waste was larger than their need. The numbers reveal the whole picture. German offensive allocation was 5 million gallons. Americans deliberately destroyed 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption reached 7.5 million gallons. Piper captured 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld. That was 0.6% of a single American day of fuel. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans. It also ended the last reserves of the Wehrmacht. More important than the casualties was the spread of knowledge through German formations. America possessed abundance beyond comprehension. Piper's discovery was not only about fuel. It revealed the nature of industrial war. Victory would go to the side that produced the most petroleum, steel and aluminum. Germany never had a real chance. American forces later catalogued abandoned German equipment at Leyes and found 39 intact tanks left only because there was no fuel. Major Robert Harrison wrote a salvage note that stated fuel required 8,000 gallons and classification minimal and source local reserve and time 4 hours. What the Germans could not do the Americans could handle with a routine request. 8,000 gallons to save first-rate tanks was below American notice. It was a minor transfer from local stock that exceeded Camp Grupper Piper at its strongest moment. This was Piper's discovery at Honsfeld. It was not only that America had more fuel. It was that the American scale made German scarcity meaningless. The war ended when American industry reached full power. Honsfeld confirmed what had been true since 1942. Germany tried to fight the impossible and measured defeat by gallons while America measured victory by oceans. The Tiger tank stands in Leglas Museum with its fuel gauge at empty. It is a monument to the day when tactical skill met logistical reality and failed. Visitors ask why such a powerful tank was left behind. The answer is simple and final. There was no fuel.